Okay, welcome to the 10th Postdigital Lunch of the Leibniz Science Campus. Today's topic is the socio-ethical and regulatory implications of location-based hyperlocal media communication. My name is Per-Ole. I'm a PhD student at the Ostfalia University of Applied Sciences in Salzgitter, and I work at the project Locative News, Local N, and more on this later. I would hand over to Professor Dr. Harald.
So thanks, Per-Ole, for introducing our project and our link to the participation campus of the Leibniz community. I would like to give you a bigger picture for this short lunch we are sharing today. From our team point of view, location-based services are a topic which definitely has to be integrated into media communication for the possibilities, that advantages location-based services have for to create content for local media is so big that we said, as researchers, we have to make sure that we create a basis for content creation, a scientific basis for content creation and for content offerings on a hyperlocal sphere, in a hyperlocal sphere, or on hyperlocal platforms. Why hyperlocal? For if we use location-based services, the logic of local news, local newspapers, mostly newspapers, the basis is getting we have the chance to look even closer to parts of cities, to parts of this local definition for use, for news. And hyperlocality is a kind of sublocal approach to the news. So we are looking to the hyperlocal sphere, and not only to a journalistically defined local sphere of creating content for news. So this is the background for the project Locative News, and the project Locative News is coming from an entire project we started on location-based services in media communication 5 years ago. So we are researching on this topic here at Ostfalia University of Applied Sciences in Salzgitter for about 5.5 years now. And the project originally was funded by the European Fund for Regional Development. And this is quite interesting, for regional development leads us back to local journalism, to local media communication, and it's quite good linked. And I'm so happy that Robert Abbas made it possible to talk to us and talk with us today. And Per-Ole will now give the frame for our project, and he will introduce Robert, who is right now sitting in Australia at the University of Wollongong. Thanks for being with us, Robert.
Thank you. Robert, if you could say a few words about who you are, and maybe in a few sentences your research background.
Thank you, Per-Ole, and thank you, Harald. My name is Robert Abbas, and I am delighted to be here today with you from Wollongong, Australia. I'm a lecturer and academic program director with the Faculty of Business and Law at the University of Wollongong in Australia. I'm also the co-editor of the IEEE Transactions on Technology and Society, which is a transdisciplinary publication outlet focused on exploring the intersection of technology, society and science, with the emphasis on interactions with socio-technical systems. In terms of background, I have an undergraduate honours degree in information and communication technology and a PhD in location-based services regulation. So I'm delighted to be here today to discuss location-based services, some of the socio-ethical and regulatory implications. And thank you for the invitation and for having me.
It's our pleasure. Okay, so I like to start with a basic short definition of what location-based services actually are, since they are the core topic of today's discussion. Location-based services, often abbreviated as LBS, enable geographic localization of mobile devices in order to provide users with personalized information of their current location. I think that's a very good short definition of this, but Roba or Harald, if you would like to expand on this anytime, feel free to do so. Yeah, the localization of the mobile device usually takes place via satellite-based networks or cellular-based technologies. For example, for more precise outdoor localization, there's the global positioning system, the GPS. And for network-based localization, there's often mobile networks or Wi-Fi localization techniques being used. There's also the possibility of locating the device through the use of beacons. These are small radio transmitters and often work through Bluetooth, over Bluetooth. Right, as Harald already mentioned, this began as the project Location-Based Services in Regional Media Communication starting in 2015. So this is a bit of background from our perspective. It's okay, in English it's ERDF, not EFRE. ERDF funded project Location-Based Services in Regional Media Communication, and its goal is to establish success models and recommendations for action with concrete success factors and evaluation methods for the digital transformation of regional media communication. Yeah, since we are building on top of this, this might be quite interesting for an introduction. That's why I'm bringing this up here. We already covered a bit of acceptance research in different sectors, like for example, the tourism sector, etc. We did focus group discussions with many representatives of relevant sectors for LBS deployment. And this was quite interesting. In the journalism sector, the participants mostly thought of location-based service integration as a way of an advertising or marketing tool. So we decided to make follow-up interviews, which kind of confirmed this notion of the local journalists. Yes, also as part of the participation week, which is currently ongoing of the Leibniz Science Campus, we made follow-up focus group discussions just this Monday. We did a big market exploration in order to find out which functions actually exist, which services exist, which techniques are being used, etc. Literature reviews. We did a Delphi study. This is actually the first time we met Roba and got into contact with her, right? And right now, ongoing as the last step before a final report is the prototyping approach. Here we try to integrate LBS into a participatory reputation system for journalism. More on this can be heard tomorrow on the campus day. Right. Now to my PhD project, Locative News, the goal and the research subject of this. The goal of this is to explore participation opportunities that arise from the use of location-based services. This was mostly based on the kind of interesting findings I just mentioned from the journalism sector. And the research subject are LBS and their potentials for participatory communication in the sublocal space in the post-digital age. So the main research question in this is, how can successful societal media communication on a hyperlocal level be achieved with participatory LBS? The central thesis based on our current research so far on our previous findings is that LBS have the potential to form a crucial link between conventional news consumption, which is mainly based professional journalism, and participatory functional equivalence, instead of letting these both exist in competition with each other. So there's a slight shift in focus of what I've been researching so far, which is now more based on location-based news, LBN, abbreviated as LBN. Right. But also during all this research, another important aspect became apparent. It's that there's this socio-ethical implications. For example, the data security and privacy concerns, etc. And going hand in hand with that, the question whether and how LBS should be regulated. And yeah, in terms of this, we are pleased to have an expert in this field with us today. And I would gladly hand over to Roba to present her current research background.
Okay, thanks so much for that great introduction. Can you see my slides okay?
Yes.
Excellent, thank you. So good evening or afternoon once again, and thank you so much for this invitation to take part in your post-digital lunch. To the organisers, thank you so much for facilitating this session. I'm honoured to be here today to engage in discussions about socio-ethical and regulatory implications of location-based hyperlocal media communication. So as part of this presentation and just following on from what we just heard, I'll be sharing some of our work in the location-based services domain with a focus on regulation and stakeholder participation as key topic areas, and in keeping with the prominent themes that we're going to address and discuss as part of this session. And I also look forward to questions and to discussions in which I hope to draw further on some of our previous and our current and also future projects. Before I do that,
if I may intervene once more, sorry for that. I just
sure, go for it.
If the audience wants to ask any questions during our presentations, please feel free to use the link to tweet back, which should be under the YouTube video right now. Thank you. Sorry.
Not a problem, thank you. Before I start, I just wanted to note that I'm joining you this evening, as I mentioned earlier, from the city of Wollongong in Australia, which you can see on your screen. And I would like to begin by, before presenting a research overview and some of our current and prior research, to give an acknowledgement of country, to acknowledge the traditional custodians of Dharawal country and pay my respects to their elders past and present. I would also like to recognise the efforts of some of my collaborators on the work that I'll be detailing today. In particular, Professor Katina Michael, Associate Professor M.G. Michael, Associate Professor Rob Nichols, all of whom have been involved in the location-based services projects to be discussed today, and more recently, Professor Jeremy Pitt, who is from Imperial College London, who is collaborating with us on progressing this work into the public interest technology space with respect to location-based systems and methodologies, particularly in the context of next generation socio-technical design methodologies and frameworks, some of which I'll touch on as part of my talk. And this is very much a multidisciplinary team with expertise across a range of areas such as information systems, engineering, regulation, philosophy, theology, and history. As part of this presentation, it will be quite a short presentation, about 10 to 15 minutes, and I'll be providing an introduction to advanced location-based services, following on from what we heard in terms of a definition, just to frame our discussion, which provides us just a means of discussion and a way to position our work. I'll also be looking at providing a research timeline or a consolidated view of our research over time, after which I'll delve deeper into the outcomes of some of our LBS regulation projects. In terms of the approach and major findings, we can discuss methodology and other aspects as part of the discussions. In the interest of time, I'll just provide a brief overview. And I'll also end by looking at current research and then providing an indication of our research trajectory moving forward. In our research, which spans the time between our LBS research that spans the time between 2009 and roughly 2020 in terms of the prior projects, we were very much looking at what are regarded as advanced location-based services, or LBS, as we heard earlier. As part of the literature, numerous definitions have been proposed, and on your slide is our adapted definition, which regards location-based services, or LBS, as applications that combine location and position of a mobile device associated with a given entity, so an individual or object, together with that contextual information. So the coupling of contextual information is quite important here, to offer a value-added service to the end user over a wireless network. I won't cover some of the aspects which have been covered so well earlier, but it's worth noting for the context of our discussions today that end users can potentially be your consumers or citizens. There are also businesses and also government entities that we need to take into account when we are having regulatory discussions. So for example, government entities could be engaged from the perspective of regulation, for instance, or also in an emergency management context as a usability scenario. We were approaching our team, the study of LBS, from the perspective of socio-technical systems design. So it's important to note that early on here, looking at consultative processes, which is really important for that participatory element we'll be discussing today. So participatory processes relating to mobile commerce and also location commerce applications. I thought it might be worthwhile to just provide a brief overview of our timeline in terms of study in this field, and in terms of origins of our study into location-based services. The team at large commenced work in the social implications of emerging technology space around 2005 to 2006. And at that time, we were looking into cybersecurity and public sector information. And it was around 2008 to 2009 where we started to work on a grant funded by the Australian Research Council, which was called a discovery grant, so part of the discovery grant scheme. And that was concerned with determining whether there was the need to regulate the location-based services industry within the Australian context, and aspects also relevant to the design of location-based services. The chief investigator on this grant was Professor Katina Michael, and since this time we have been investigating various facets of location-based services and emerging technologies in general, and also in terms of the interplay with regulation, ethics, and society, which is important for our discussion today. That is the manner in which all of these areas play out within socio-technical systems and structures at various levels. By those levels, I mean at the individual level, for instance, at the organizational level, industry, and also societal. And I'll bring that into the discussion when we talk about regulatory frameworks in a moment, because it's quite important. We are also looking at the moment into future modes of operation, which are represented on your screen too in terms of the timeline, considering particularly collaborative socio-technical design approaches, and a term that we've been working on more specifically in socio-technical co-design. In the interest of time, my focus here will be on the outcomes of projects that we conducted between 2009 and 2020, and how we approached the topic area of location-based services regulation. So to set the scene, we developed an initial understanding regarding the location-based services landscape by defining a challenge with respect to location-based services regulation. That these applications were at the time of the study, and to some extent still currently are, being designed, they're being developed, and they're being implemented without due consideration of the socio-ethical and the regulatory implications. So there was very much a technocentric approach that was quite dominant, and socio-ethical and socio-ethics and regulation were somewhat secondary considerations at best, or neglected or disregarded in some instances and in some application areas. By employing a consultative socio-technical design approach, we presented a regulatory solution and design-related outcomes pertaining to the design of location-based services, not only within the Australian context, but I think something that also works across other contexts and can also be utilised in the context of other emerging technologies, which I'll come back to in our public interest technology framework in a moment. The journey from the theoretical underpinnings of the project, which is shown here on the left-hand side of your slide, through to the solution that I alluded to on the previous slide, which is also highlighted here in red, we engaged in that consultative socio-technical process with the users, with industry, and with government representatives across the complex location-based services value chain. And we defined value chain members or stakeholders as being either operational or non-operational, and having a range of different roles, and the user was very much within that process. And we did so in order to collaboratively determine. So we took a collaborative approach to the problem to determine whether we need to regulate the location-based services industry in Australia, and how a potential regulatory framework would look in terms of its constituent elements or its components. And I'll be happy to discuss some of those in further detail during our discussion if anyone is interested in the specifics. One thing, however, that I'd like to draw attention to here on this slide before I move to the next is that funnel that you can see, which graphically represents the 3 phases of our consultation, leading to a consolidated regulatory response as a primary outcome. So that was really important for us to have that as our goal or objective of the study, but there were also additional or supplementary outcomes emerging from this process. Within the scope of these 3 phases within that funnel, we were looking at aspects to do with usability as part of the first phase, and stakeholder relationships in that value chain, and the dynamics in phases 2 and 3. Additionally, underlying the 3 phases was an exploration and geospatial modelling of some of the socio-ethical dilemmas, and a review of existing regulations and regulatory provisions. And we did that toward the establishment of a regulatory framework or provisions based on reconciling interests of diverse stakeholders in that location-based services value chain. And a key feature here is that consultative element and the reconciling of interests, and that was very much derived from the theoretical underpinnings. In terms of the framework or our proposed solution, the regulatory framework in question, or in essence, the way we conceptualized an answer to that challenge or that problem domain, is shown here in a pyramid form. And if I can direct your attention from that top tier, so from the individual level, which represents usability context at that tip, to the organizational centric perspective that takes into account service provisioning. Then we go through to the industry level, expressing the need for the needs of industry, so the LBS industry, from the perspective of technological development and the technological landscape, right through to the government perspective, where there is an emphasis on legal protection in context. And we can see that those elements that I just mentioned on either side of the pyramid exist to support other areas. I'd also like to draw your attention to the text that's highlighted in red, which really shows the type of regulation. So we start off with the regulation of behavior through perhaps ethical and moral codes, self-regulation at the industry level, which can be achieved through internal policies and codes within business or within a company, and other technical guidelines, standards, or alternate embedded mechanisms which operate at that industry level. And last of all, we have legislation. So that's the laws that regulate certain aspects relevant to location-based services in the Australian context. So when we were looking at the Australian context, just to give you a bit of an insight, there was a collection of laws at both federal and state level that applied in this scenario, and we need to work within that particular frame. And this is in effect the culmination of that initial grant upon which we have built subsequent work or subsequent research, forming our current research program as a group, which I'll briefly describe and then hand back for discussion. So one such example of current work, which also points to our future research trajectory, is shown in this socio-technical ecosystems view, oriented towards the design and development of public interest technology. So within this framework, we can consider the design of socio-technical solutions or systems such as location-based services from a complex ecosystem perspective, taking into account a range of elements, of which regulation is one component, but there are others too. I think a key feature for this framework is especially pertinent to this discussion is the operationalization stage, which you can see on your screen. And it's here that we engage in deliberate socio-technical design approaches, which are participatory in nature and have a range of distinct attributes. And I'd be happy to talk more about those during Q&A. But just to wrap up, we're currently working within the context of future modes of operation relevant to location-based services and other emerging technologies to implement this framework in practice. And that's essentially where we're headed research-wise. And I think I'll probably just finish that discussion here. Hopefully that's given you a sense of some of our work into the LBS space. Thank you.
thank you very much. That was quite interesting. And yeah, so right now, the audience can feel free, of course, to ask questions via tweetback. Other than that, we, of course, would have some questions or would like to enter a discussion right now. And the first one I would like to ask would be one that maybe aims at connecting my PhD project with your research so far, which is that LBS based on user-generated content allow users to collaborate in a way that makes them content producers, in contrast to conventional LBS, where the boundaries between service providers and the user are more clearly defined. So taking a look at this pyramid that you've shown, is there, well, how to phrase it? Does this pyramid cover these types of LBS as well? And does this affect the need or measures for regulation in a certain way? Especially considering location-based news apps, maybe?
Sure, that's a great question. And I think there are so many elements there that probably warrant some unpacking. I think in terms of the particular use case that you're speaking about, so the regulatory pyramid is quite generic in a sense that it can be applied in multiple contexts. Within the scope of that application, I think is the need to define what the application area is. So if we're talking about usability scenarios where the user is a content producer, it's just a shift in our framework or our contextual background. Now, in terms of the application of a regulatory framework, in terms of participatory LBS and whether we require, for instance, alternate types of regulation, I think we need to go through the motions of discussing a number of things. So first of all, there's the, it depends on context, as I said. So you've got your technological landscape and the community in question, and you're talking at that sort of hyperlocal community. I think in this instance, what might maybe differentiates our work and the level at which we were discussing the regulatory framework is the rules of engagement that need to be developed, given the participatory approach or aspect. And that would be working in that tip of that framework. So when we're thinking about ethical and moral codes, how people use those systems. But beyond that, I see that there's a lot of overlap in what in how we apply that framework. We also need to consider other things around, I think, how we think about and how we consider moderation, editing, traditional roles in news and news production. These are things that are common to that particular usability context, how we deal with propagation of incorrect, potentially misleading or harmful content. And then there's a tiered approach to regulation where you consider perhaps codes, then you look at policies, then you look at standards, potentially guidelines and laws. But I still see that same framework applying just to a different usability context.
Okay. Okay.
So if you don't mind, I drop in. And for me, it's really interesting that I like this term of public interest technology you used. And for it's quite near to public service broadcasting. And public service broadcasting, either in Australia or in Europe, is a field which is highly regulated or sophisticated. Let me say, sophistically regulated. Do you see the chance, by talking about location-based services, to find new ways of regulations, which is a regulation being different from the terms of regulation we find with the public service broadcast media?
That's a great question. I'm just going to have a bit of a think about that, Professor Harald. I think there are two aspects to the response, and this is just going to be a quick response, and I'll be thinking as I'm doing that. There's the public interest broadcasting regulation element, which I think some of aspects of that will remain unchanged. And then we've got the same issues that we encountered with our initial studies around how do we regulate location-based services. So do we introduce specific regulations? Do we encompass location-based services under current regulatory frameworks? And in terms of pointing to a potential answer here to your question, and you can guide me as to whether I achieved that or not, when we solicited advice of or engaged with our stakeholders as part of our LBS regulation process, project, and we're trying to determine, as I said, whether there is the need to regulate location-based services in Australia. We focused on 5 different usability contexts, ranging in risk category. So for those from low risk in an emergency situation, for example, right through to those that are associated with catastrophic levels of risk. So when we went to when we engaged in our consultative socio-technical process, we asked industry, we asked users, and we asked government to comment on current regulatory provisions. And I think something that might be beneficial for this discussion here is there was a common thread that we do not require new regulations specific to location-based services, but rather we need to work within existing frameworks to define new areas or regulate specific aspects of use. In the context that you're speaking about, so in the journalism context, more broadly in public service broadcasting, which I'm trying in my head to sort of link to public interest technology as we're speaking, I think it's quite different to regulating an emergency scenario, for example. So it's quite a tricky one. What I think would be helpful in the context of this project more specifically is to do a similar consultative study where you're going to all of those stakeholders and asking for their viewpoints. And I'd be happy to share more information about that process. So we started off with an observational study of users where they used a particular data logging device over a period of time. And we, from that emerged a range of socio-ethical issues that we needed to consider. We then developed some geospatial, through geospatial analysis, a range of different scenarios across that risk spectrum, which was at that time defined by Emergency Management Australia, and we used that as a basis of as the basis of storyboards that then formed a consultation paper, and then we went out to the industry to solicit their advice on those instances of use. So I think it would be really an incredible opportunity and something that would be quite interesting to extend that. And one area of use would be in the context of your study and talk about specific regulatory provisions in that instance. And that's sort of, there's much more to say, but I think I might hand over to you to hear your thoughts.
What is really interesting for us is that we found that by integrating user-generated content and combining that with regulation, with privacy concerns, with security, everything changes.
Do you mind elaborating in what respect?
So by integrating user-generated content, we found that users are behaving differently. They see their role in a different way. They are no longer only consumers. They are more integrated into the complete and into the entire process. And with that, they think differently about privacy concerns, and they think differently about data security options. And perhaps this is comparable to this approach with this public interest technology. For it's in the same way changing the view or changing the perspective on letting applications be linked to my location.
Sure. That's a very interesting point. So was it changing in terms of providing or in terms of an increased sense of awareness around privacy and security? Did you find that that was the link? So there was an increased, I guess, concern about some of the socio-ethical implications?
Exactly.
Or yeah, that's unsurprising, I guess, given the user-generated aspect of it. Did you find, if you don't mind me asking, did you find any considerations or discussions or issues around control and trust? So control from the perspective of surveillance, data valence, concerns over ubervalence, for instance, things around profiling based on the user-generated content and the creation of, for example, digital personas and dossiers. Was there anything of that nature that emerged as part of your discussion? I'm very curious.
So the interesting thing is, if you're open to share own content, privacy concerns are moving into the background. They are not longer standing in the middle of the discussion. So we ask ourselves whether it would be good to foster or to support generating user-generated content, to support the users being producers, to support them that by producing, they lose their privacy concerns.
That's very interesting.
I think that's an interesting approach for us to think further. For our goal or our intention is to create media, media in not only as a one way offer, but as a two-way offer, and especially for communities, for smaller communities in the hyperlocal sphere, which is fitting quite well into your ecosystem approach, by the way.
Absolutely. Yeah, I was thinking about the ecosystem approach, the socio-technical approach. So as I was just considering prior to attending this session, some of the overlaps I see, particularly when we get down to discussions around these social living labs and other approaches and methodologies that you're using, that there's quite a connection between the socio-technical approach, the ecosystems perspective, and how we actually work within the context of location-based services. Very interesting ideas. I found the notion of, as you support users in becoming producers, they lose some of their privacy concerns, which is very interesting. I think it mirrors some of the findings that we had as part of our observational study. So some of the insights in that respect were that users over time, as they had those data logging devices, would just forget about that and that they were being monitored or being recorded, or that they were recording their location chronicles, for example. And we were able to really view that as part of the reflective component. So in addition to the data logging, we also had a diary component where they were writing down their thoughts, and you can see that over time it became sort of normalized in their practice, but not in all
it works.
cases.
Yeah, and it works.
That's right, which is, I think it's interesting and it's concerning, because I think concerning in some respects, that openness to share and privacy being in the background, I don't think necessarily has to be the case. So it doesn't, we could create potentially this open sharing content production environment without users having to forego privacy. And I don't think you're necessarily talking about the foregoing of privacy as part of your discussion. You're just saying it's no longer a concern based on the studies that you've had. But wouldn't it be great to create public interest technology, socio-technical systems that issue reminders to users about their privacy settings, their privacy concerns, or some of the privacy concerns that might be prevalent. And that's where we can draw in some elements from that regulatory pyramid. So as part of that, I think the developers, or the industry, the developers, the organizations, or that value chain that's in charge of creating those underlying location-based services have the opportunity to embed, or can potentially embed, some technological mechanisms that serve in that regulatory capacity. So the things inbuilt into the actual features of the location-based service that potential users or content producers are utilizing. And I think there are so many opportunities in the project that you're doing. I think it's really fascinating from the design of these systems right through to that boundary, or that I guess the dissipation of the boundary between the users and you framed it so well. So the users are no longer consumers, as you said, and that's a really interesting dynamic that I think is worth exploring. There is that dynamic, and there's also the relationship aspect. So that featured quite heavily in our work, which I didn't have a chance to touch on. Different types of relationships. So within a family context, within other contexts, what happens when you utilize your location-based services to those dynamics? And this is no different, particularly when you're thinking about the dynamics between the consumers who are no longer consumers, they're the content producers now, traditional journalism at the local level. I think there's something to be discussed at that particular point. The role of editors, the role of photographers, how we work into that image space, and a lot of other things that I think, some of which are documented in the literature, and others I'd be really interested to find out what your project, the insights from your project based on all the work you're doing. There's so much in there, yeah.
Per-Ole, I don't know whether I may put another question into this subject, or the audience already.
Subject. So Go on, please.
So what I wonder is, by listening to your really short and very condensed presentation, is whether there will be a shift in perspective by coming from society to community. So for us, in our approach, it's of big worth, of big value, to concentrate on, let's say, smaller audiences, not linked to an entire town or city, but linked to parts of the town or city. So, and in the English language, for me, it's you have this distinction between society and community. We do not have that in German, in the German language, which sometimes makes it very difficult to get into a clear discussion. But having the possibility to do so, perhaps you can shortly comment on that, whether there's really a shift in perspective by lowering some kind of lowering society, the entire society, down to community discussions. And coming back to your pyramid, I miss society or community as a part of this pyramid. And perhaps we can wonder where we integrate that into your pyramid. Well, for this pyramid approach is great.
I love that. There's so much I'd like to comment on now, so I'll just go through what I've noted. I think you touch on a very, very key point, the importance of community, and a lot of the projects that we're embarking on at the moment have that community focus. Interestingly, I was part of I was attending a seminar a few weeks ago where there were discussions around global frameworks, international frameworks, governance frameworks, around regulation, around values, around artificial intelligence, and someone made that exact point, in which I wholeheartedly agree. And with your point that we can have these overarching frameworks, but we need something at the community level for them to work. Back to the pyramid, I'll address that comment first and then go back a bit. In terms of the regulatory pyramid, the focus or our unit of analysis at that time was to look at it at multiple levels and at the societal level, because our problem statement was around establishing whether there was the need to regulate the location-based services industry. So we were working within an existing regulatory framework and context. We recognized that there were federal laws that apply, and there was almost a patchwork of regulatory frameworks and mechanisms. We also recognized that there was the need to work within state level regulatory mechanisms, and then you have your industry, you have companies that have their existing frameworks and practices, and then we need to always remember that human-centric perspective of the user. So our problem statement was such that our focus was not intended to focus on the community at that particular point in time. We were rather looking for a regulatory solution to a problem. So is there the need to regulate, and how do we regulate within the context of existing mechanisms in Australia? So that in Australia really allowed us to focus on that society aspect. Back to your point about the shift in perspective, I think it's a really important and necessary shift. So emerging from our work and subsequent projects, that community aspect is key. So we can think about overarching regulatory frameworks, but when it comes down to that hyper sphere, as you called it, the community level, I wholeheartedly agree, particularly in future modes of operation. So our future modes of operation that are potentially location enabled, we'll be looking at the Internet of Things based infrastructures, for example, that exist at a community or a smaller scale, potentially at a larger scale if we think smart cities, for example, and so on. So there's that opportunity for designing for that community aspect. But I think I'm in agreement with the need to look at community. Now, to your question, I think that's the question I haven't touched on yet, how community will factor into the regulatory pyramid, I think is a very worthwhile discussion. I'll be interested to hear where you see community as being positioned there. And I think it's that regulatory pyramid can be extended to focus on different levels. So at the individual level, then we can have potentially a community, a hyperlocal community, your local community, and then you can sort of apply it to the context of, in sort of concentric circles, apply it to the context of your particular use case. But I think it's a great point and something that I'd love to discuss even further offline with you. I think it's worth thinking about different instances and implementations of that regulatory framework, and that was its intention. So not to be prescriptive in a sense that this is the way to regulate location-based services, but this is a model that can then be applied to a variety of different contexts, usability scenarios and different use cases, but the elements are there to show more than anything, I think, the importance of a human-centric approach, but also the importance of a tiered approach. So I don't think regulation alone would work, even in the context of your example. And I think what's really important as well is something which I haven't had the chance to discuss yet, is the importance of what we're terming socio-technical co-design, where it's a process of empowerment and engagement of a range of stakeholders to design these systems, to design these regulatory provisions, to think about community and how design will fit from the context of, or from the perspective of location-based services, but also other emerging technologies, because we need to remember these socio-technical systems, while location-based services are one element, there are other elements and potentially converging technologies, converging devices, and so on.
Perhaps we need not only one pyramid, but 2 or 3 pyramids, and
yes.
That might be an approach to get over that, or to can handle that. And perhaps, Per-Ole, you can comment on this aspect of integrating stakeholders as co-designers for the processes. For this was one of the results we measured, or we were able to generate in our big Delphi study. You also had been in, and Per-Ole is quite far with the interpretation of the outcome, or of the results of this Delphi study. And if you will like, Per-Ole, you can just probably get into this aspect of co-designing by stakeholders.
Yeah, right. But basically, it was just what you said. The Delphi participants just said integrate also the users who are actually at the end the ones who use the product into the design process. And right, and we at the Leibniz Science Campus, we have this social living lab approach, which we always like to integrate. So maybe you can elaborate a bit on that. You said you have co-design approaches, or you work with co-design approaches. Could you maybe give us an example on that? That would have also been one of my questions that I noted, because that's very interesting for us to hear.
Yes. Yeah, not a problem. Yeah, I'm very excited to hear about the outcomes of your Delphi study, by the way. Yes. So that'd be great to know more about that. I think it's been over a year since that time. I find the, sorry, go ahead.
No, I'm just saying we're just in the publishing process and just in revision.
Wonderful.
So we'll
excellent.
Update it.
Look forward to it. So would you like me to speak about the value of the social living labs as connected to co-design, or talk about the co-design approach as we see it? And maybe both, some examples there. Both. Yeah, okay, I'll start off by thinking about the social living labs, which I've been encouraged to look more at recently. I think there are some common elements, and they're highly complementary. Our vision for socio-technical co-design, more specifically, which I'll be happy to point in the direction of some resources around that definition and some new conceptualizations. I think the social living lab approach that you've taken is quite good from a number of perspectives. I like the approach to coordination, co-creation, and co-design of knowledge and of systems in a real world setting. I think that's something that's really appealing. It's really appealing in our work as well. And that's something that's highly complementary, and I think quite consistent with our approach to really get out there in a real world setting, empower users to become designers, facilitated through obviously the technical designers themselves, and through specific processes and obviously configurations, because there's different ways in which you can configure a co-design effort, particularly from a systems or socio-technical systems design perspective. I think something that's really promising about the Living Labs approach, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, my understanding is it provides a learning mechanism, both a formalized learning mechanism and also an informal learning mechanism. And that's really important, particularly in the context as I see it, if I've understood correctly, and I'd like to find out more about your project, but if I've understood correctly from the perspective of education around your media creation. Some of the articles that you provided me with access to or with links to prior to this spoke about that educational component. And I think that's something, a gap that you can fulfill as part of the Social Living Labs approach. To look at the education element, education in terms of how to create that content so that it's valuable. I think also something that is potentially missing, but I haven't looked that closely into it, is education as to the socio-ethical implications, particularly in a response to Professor Harald's comments about understanding of privacy diminishing, or I guess concern for privacy diminishing. I think the educational component from that perspective is important and is quite prominent, or quite easy to achieve, I think, in the Living Labs approach due to that direct contact with your stakeholders. Something that I think would be interesting, and I'm not sure whether you're considering this within the Social Living Labs approach, is that interplay between potentially public forums for content creation versus the private forums. And that's something that I guess you can facilitate through that approach. The user-centered element is obviously very appealing. And I think the boundaries and scope of participation, if they're done in a way in consultation with your participants, which I'm assuming are users in addition to others, given the co-design element, is I think something that's really appealing. And there's also something that is common between your vision, or as I understand your vision with the Learning Labs methodology, and our vision is that evolving ecosystem. And we need to remember that these are living systems, these are socio-technical systems that interact in a way that they're continuously evolving. So defining a regulatory pyramid such as our regulatory pyramid is great, but we also need to acknowledge the fact that this is embedded within a broader ecosystem that has dynamics that sometimes just cannot be measured. And that's something that we realistically need to think about. So as I said, now moving on to the other aspect in terms of the socio-technical co-design approach, and I'll be interested in finding out if this is your vision for co-design as well, or as you understand it. I think the way that we view socio-technical co-design, apart from the human-centered aspect, the need to empower users, the idea of working towards this public interest technology vision, and the underlying values that would be embedded within a system as a result, I think something that's really important is the way in which it fits in current systems development processes. And that's partly our approach, given our academic backgrounds, also our interest in this work, and where we started off in terms of those projects, those preliminary projects. But all of these co-design approaches, whatever type of system we're co-designing, I think the importance of, or the value of thinking of how it fits within broader innovation and technological development processes is quite important. And I'll just cut off that discussion there because I'd like to hear from you as well. But there's much to say about that point, co-designing and then embedding that co-design within existing frameworks.
Okay, yeah, I think that matches our vision pretty well. And also what's interesting to me is this aspect that you mentioned about privacy concerns, overcoming privacy concerns. There was also an outcome of our Delphi study that this is especially something you could achieve by integrating users into the design processes in general. Yeah, I think I would like to get on to my next question, since we are running a little late on time. So yeah, which would be I'd like to give a little background before this. As many scenarios have initially assumed that users would become communicators in their immediate environment with location-based news. But this has not really materialized, at least not in Germany. I don't know about other countries. I think also this might be a bit region specific. You could say some words about that. But editorial teams rarely allow their audiences to participate as co-producers over here, and beyond follow-up communication, and are more interested in attracting and retaining their readers with the options given by location-based services. So what I'm interested now is, do you think the current lack of a real regulatory system might be a cause for that, or could at least be in connection with this? And yeah, that would be my question.
It's a great question, to which I'm not sure I have the answer to it, but I think we can point to the direction of something useful here. So I guess it could be a contributing factor to it, but I'm not sure if there are other additional issues in relation to that. I'm just trying to think. I don't know whether the underlying issue here is the displacement of traditional journalism or traditional media or traditional broadcasting or content creation. I don't know if it's from a business model perspective. I don't know if it's sort of a turf war thing. I guess it might be a range of different aspects. What I think would be interesting would be to go out to those who are demonstrating resistance or who are opposed to this approach, to go out to industry and solicit their advice as to why there is a pushback. And use that as the basis for building on that, because I think it's too hard for us. We can just speculate as to what the reason might be. Whether regulation assists or not, it's hard to tell, because I think something that has emerged from this discussion to me is we're talking about different forms of regulation. So we need to think about, regulation in terms of socio-ethics, in terms of behaviors, in terms of the industry itself, because you can't forget there's still that underlying value chain that provides that location device. So when we talk about co-designing, are you talking about co-designing that particular aspect around the content generation, or are you talking about co-designing the entire LBS socio-technical ensemble, in which case things get more complicated. So even so, with the discussion about regulation, what are we talking about in terms of regulation? Is it regulating that specific instance of use? Is it providing a framework to say that if users are to become content generators, this is what they need to follow in order to be permitted to generate content, in which case there's a lot of considerations to take into account, but that still doesn't negate our traditional regulatory discussions around location and how we store location, issues of control, surveillance, trust. They're completely, these are fundamental issues that, regardless of whether we are talking about the content generation use case, still exists. So perhaps the lack of regulation could be inhibiting the flourishing of this particular use case, this particular context. I'm not sure. I think that's an entirely new project, maybe as part of your postdoc.
Yeah, it just came to me, this question when
it's a great question.
Maybe this could be this lack of a regulation model would maybe be a factor holding back the participation so far.
May I interrupt for short? There's a question from the audience coming in, and if you don't mind, I will just read it.
Yeah,
and there are only 4 minutes left for the discussion, so I try to speed up. Is there a danger, Robert, that ethics becomes an add-on or a checklist rather than being thought of as being fundamental to the design? Do you have any concrete examples of how to make ethics, etc., more than an add-on?
What a great question, and what a shame that we have 3 minutes now to cover that. I think we need a follow-up. Time flies, though. That is a fabulous question in which I can spend probably half an hour talking about. I think there is always a danger, particularly in terms of technological development and existing technology development cycles, of ethics becoming an add-on. And that's traditionally the way that things work. So in my teaching, for example, I've taught ethics in engineering, design and management. And in that space, we think of ethics as an afterthought. So we develop our system, we experiment. That's the nature of engineering systems and designing and things like that. And then we think, what are the implications of this system? So to answer the question in short, there is a danger of it becoming an add-on. I think that's where our work collectively is really important, to define these collaborative and participatory design processes, specifically socio-technical design, to say there is an alternate way of doing this. There are other models that we can use, and we're heavily invested in that space at the moment. And we think it's quite a very valuable area. So how do we convert these existing design approaches to encompass ethics as a precursor, not as an afterthought? And I think part of the answer to that, in short and conscious of time, is to work within the existing framework, as we did with the regulatory pyramid, recognizing that something does exist. We're not coming to replace or displace something that's in existence. Rather, we are coming to supplement. We are introducing this collaborative approach, this human-centric socio-technical co-design approach, to allow us to actually map out the socio-ethical landscape, in addition to the regulatory landscape, prior to designing the systems, in consultation with users. And we spoke about users quite a lot, but I think for further discussion, it might be interesting to widen that stakeholder base. So we need users, we also need government, we also need regulators, standardization bodies, and a lot of other members of the LBS value chain to make this work. And I think I do have concrete examples, but I'm conscious of time. I'm not sure if we have time for them.
Perhaps you can just drop in one or two.
Yeah.
Okay. So which one? Okay. The concrete example that I would choose is we've been involved, or maybe I'll just give it a summary. We've been involved in numerous projects. We are developing one at the moment in which we are hoping to design a location-enabled platform that ensures the safety and freedom of individuals living with dementia or neurocognitive conditions. And as part of that process, we are mapping out the ethical landscape. We are trying to develop methodologies for socio-technical systems co-design prior to even thinking about what the technological platform looks like. And that platform, we have defined prerequisites or stipulated what we think that platform needs to entail as part of this LBS work, in fact, as a follow-on. And they're things to do with values, things to do with care platforms. And I had that on my timeline, but didn't have a chance to discuss in great detail. So how do we move from these advanced location-based services, for example, to platforms of care, to transdisciplinary approaches in which we engage multiple stakeholders, to socio-technical co-design approaches that actually work in practice within the scope and context and framework of existing design methodologies? Because unless we approach this from a transdisciplinary perspective, it just won't work. So we can design systems that then are not implemented in practice, or are not valuable to the end user, or that industry does not, implement in a useful manner. So there's a lot to it, but that's one example of starting off with values, starting off with ethics, starting from a very human-centered perspective and going from there, rather than thinking, what's the feasibility study? What are the business models? What are the economic models? They certainly have a part to play, and we're not sort of discouraging emphasis and thought about that. But I think the real emphasis has to be on the end user, the individuals themselves, and also that community aspect that you spoke about. So how do we upper level think about it in terms of that connectivity from either a hyperlocal or a local perspective, depending on your context as well?
Okay, thank you very much. I think this is with ethics as a precursor instead of an afterthought. That's also a good final sentence, so to say, because that's also a finding we've had in the literature review, in the Delphi study, etc., that this is really a research field currently really underrepresented. So yeah, I think that's something right. A good final sentence. Thank you very much for your time, for your input. Thank you for the question in the audience. And yeah, I think if there are no further questions, maybe
we're waving to Australia. Thank you for being with us, Roba. It was really great pleasure, and thank you for this insights to your projects and to let's say the Australian society and the Australian ecosystem of regulations and privacy concerns. That's really interesting to discuss these questions on an international basis, and it's so worthy and so valuable for us. So thanks a lot. Thanks a lot for sharing your time, for having the time for us, for our projects, and for our Postdigital Lunch. Thanks a lot.
Thank you so much. Thank you. I'm honored to be here.
In Australia right now, so thank you for taking the time.
No problem. It's a digital, post-digital dinner here.